Thanks, everybody, for coming this afternoon. I think we'll get going. My name is Sandra Clarkson. I'm the CEO of the Calgary Drop-In Centre, which is an organization that provides shelter, health, and housing options in the city of Calgary. So before we get going, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement and just acknowledge that this conference is being held on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples. The peoples of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory since time immemorial. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. So just a couple of quick housekeeping items. This session is being recorded, so when we open it up to questions, we'll ask that you speak into the microphone so that it's recorded. The audio is recorded, and we do have the ability to have some French options as well with Mr. James Hughes, who can help accommodate any French language questions and answers. So, thanks again for coming here today. This is really meant to be a bit of a highlight, an overview of the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network, who we are, what we do, and then we want to open it up to just some unstructured questions from the group to answer any questions you might have about what does it mean to be housing focused, what does it take, why would we consider that, really kind of anything goes when it comes to that. And we've got, I've got Kevin Webb here, who is our Director of Shelter and Housing from the Calgary Drop-In Centre, who can also answer some questions as well, and Chris Gorman from OrgCode, in case we need some other expert help in that way. So thank you again for coming. So the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network was an idea that came out of actually a session from an Alliance conference a number of years ago that Ian DeYoung had presented on housing-focused transformation in shelters. And we started to make that change at the DI, and I'd met up with James Hughes at Old Brewery Mission in Montreal, who's been doing that work far longer than the DI has. And we thought, we're really onto something. So we want to share the knowledge, really try to create a movement across the country to change the way that traditional emergency shelters have operated in the past. And so we'll go over the mission, proposed scope and activities. I'm going to do a little bit of speaking. Grant Martin, who is our Canadian Shelter Transformation Network coordinator, will also share some activities and updates about the network. And then James Hughes, my co-chair of the network, will wrap us up, and then we'll go to questions. Or in between there. You'll see, it'll all work out. So the mission of the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network, as I mentioned, is really about shifting the way emergency shelters operate to truly be an engine to ending homelessness, and really to create flow through the system and be really about being a process and not a destination. And so there's all sorts of different activities that we've been doing since we started the network, really in 2018, 2019. And so we're continuing to build on those activities. And I know one of the questions that we will ask you is, what do you need from the network to help you in your transformation or thinking about transformation? So we do lots of resource development, capacity building, lots of resources housed on our website, as well as ideally also doing advocacy to shift the way that we're operating across the country and beyond, quite frankly. And then just know that we have a series of webinars, and they are all posted on the website, so please do be sure to go to the website. We can also, there's lots of other open source free resources there that you can download, start considering. Grant will talk in a bit more detail about some of those options. And the self-assessment tools to see where you're at on your journey to becoming housing focused is also really insightful and also helps us as well. And then, as I mentioned, like sharing tools, creating a community of practice across the country are all things that we're very actively invested in right now. So with that, I will hand it over to Grant Martin, who, as I mentioned, is our shelter transformation network coordinator. Thank you, Grant.
Thank you, Sandra. I also feel like as if, well, maybe I need to adjust the microphone. We might be slightly different heights. But I also feel too like I'm spending an entire career of having really long-winded, complicated job titles that take a lot to memorize and nobody can seem to remember. And that's just my journey professionally. But I'm really, really happy to be here today. And I want to highlight a couple things before I get into what the purpose of an Ask Me Anything session is. If you're not, or can I get a show of hands, who's already a CSTN member? You get updates from us, you attend webinars, you do all those fun things. Okay, great. Welcome. Anybody who's not a CSTN member and is interested in all those things that Sandra just mentioned, we are an open membership. So there is a QR code at the front of the room here that you can scan that will link you directly to a registration form that just asks like your email, your name, what organization you're from, if you're with an organization, and your position there. And that will make sure that you get included in the email distribution so that you can get updates on new resources or things that are hosted on the website or upcoming webinars and things like that. It's also a good way to just say, hey, oh, not that QR code though, Kevin. That's a different QR code. Thanks though. It's also, if you grab a brochure too, if you're not a friend of QR codes, you can grab a brochure. It has my email in there. You can contact me directly and I can add you to the distribution list. And Sandra kind of went over some of the things that we do. One thing that's not on there, because we've never really offered it officially, because up until 6 months ago, there hasn't been a designated person to act as a coordinator in this role. But you can also just email me or contact me directly and say like, can we have a meeting? My shelter's really struggling with this. I need some direction, some help, some resources. Or like, can you come and talk to our shelter about this thing? Or can you connect me to a shelter provider who's already doing some really cool work around that? So I'm easy to get in touch with. If it's not something that you want to connect with formally through one of the other channels, you can just contact me directly. And big or small can help out with whatever. Okay? So for an Ask Me Anything session, sorry, and I know there's a microphone I'm supposed to stay in front of it, but my body just doesn't let me do that, so I might move a bit, and my apologies. But an Ask Me Anything session, there's a few different reasons why we would do something like this. One is, ultimately, if we are a network of shelter providers across the country, how are we using a platform like this to really try to strengthen our connection and build a greater sense of community, right? I think that as shelter operators, we can feel like as if we're sitting on an island, left alone, feeling very isolated, and trying to figure out like, how do I do good prevention or diversion or rapid resolution? And I feel like as if I'm having to figure this all out on my own for the first time, and it's a lot of trial and error. Well, my hope is that the network can bring people together so that you don't have to make the same mistakes that Brian's already made or Sandra's already made, and we can share our learnings and share insights and use tools through those connections so that you don't have to go through that painful process, and you can take what we have and make adaptations to fit for your shelter, for your community. So strengthening the connection, the knowledge sharing. I think also too, like there's stuff that has to be really valuable, and it's talking about direct engagement. Like I know that I'm starting to make some direct engagement relatively with folks through virtual means like the webinars and stuff like that. But there's something nice about being with your peers in a room and like truly like don't hold back, like ask whatever you need to ask, including like, I don't know what this word means and everybody keeps using it in their shelter manuals or whatever it might be. Can you please give some clarity around that? Or things like, I hear a lot of terms tossed around interchangeably, like what's the difference between these things? So my hope is that with direct engagement, direct connection in a room, and we start to trust and like each other and get along relatively well, hopefully most of the time, is that we can ask those vulnerable questions and learn together as opposed to just hoping that I don't look dumb in front of my peers. And that's where the transparency comes in, right? So we have Sandra here, we have James here, we have other folks that are shelter leaders who can kind of talk about the progress that they've made, but they can talk about the big mistakes that they made. The things that were easier than they expected, the ones that were more difficult than they expected, and really talk about the opportunities and threats that came from that change so that you know what to expect when you go down this journey of doing shelter transformation to be lower barrier and more housing focused. So that's the purpose of the Ask Me Anything session. Our friend Chris from Org Code has a microphone that we can start taking questions. We did put the option of people to send questions in advance by emailing me them. We didn't receive any via email. I'm assuming that's because everybody was excited to share their question in person. So if you're one of those people, Chris will happily move around the room and share the mic with you to ask questions to the folks at the front of the room. So if there's anybody with a burning question, anything shelter related, anything CSTN, put your hand up and we'll try to answer the best we can.
Nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tansei, everybody. Dodie Jordan. I'm from Ganiganichik, which is an Indigenous-led organization in Winnipeg. Spell it with a K, so it's Cree, so it's Kani, but it's a G sound. So if anybody sees it, it's Ganiganichik. So we recently opened a 24/7 safe space for Indigenous women, kind of our response to the calls for justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirit community. There's none like it in Manitoba, so it's the only one in Manitoba. Winnipeg's coined ground zero for MMIWG families. So I'm wondering, and so I don't think we fit the shelter definition right now, and so because it's a unique model and we're trying to do things differently. However, when we open up the doors, we just opened the doors because 4 women lost their lives to violence that June, all of them in June. So we were like, let's get the doors open and then we'll figure what the model looks like after that. But we're still like stabilizing and the goal was 850 women and 12,980 women came through the doors just in 1 year. So nobody had an idea of what the need was going to look like. So are there any Indigenous-led shelters that we might be able to connect with or that might be able to sort of help us with a unique model of embedding Indigenous ways of being and doing in the work? And also, can we connect with you to help us figure out, even if we're not a shelter and we look slightly different, how can we develop a model that brings us in, like safety things and all of that, like where like bonkers things are happening on site that we never imagined either, like wound care with maggots coming out of their wounds and things like we never imagined, right? And it's just lived experience people doing the best they can to help people. So as the executive director, I'm always thinking, oh shit, something's going to go down, and I don't have everything in place that we should. So, pardon my language, but that's truly how I think. So if I can have any supports and help or direction or point me somewhere, I'd really appreciate that. Miigwech.
I'm going to take a picture of your thing first, so.
This is such a good idea.
I know. Whoever's idea was genius.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And I'm going to take notes, so I'm not texting my honey.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to tell.
Yeah. I mean, you're definitely welcome to take notes. I think our session is also recorded, so just know that if you don't want to take notes and you want to you can go back and look at the recording later for any kind of speaking points that you didn't jot down. There's a couple pieces to your question that I think are really important to answer. One is I want to say kudos to opening the doors where it feels almost like you're building the boat as you're kind of going down the river sort of thing. But I think what I heard there was there was a need. There was a sense of urgency that we couldn't wait to have everything perfect and in place, right? And so that's brave. So very commendable. And I think although you may not feel like you're a traditional shelter, I had a similar conversation with someone who represented the drop-ins in Toronto and saying, we run a network of drop-ins. We're not a shelter per se, but how do we integrate housing-focused interventions and lower barrier services in a drop-in space and try to replicate of what we're seeing in shelters, but just applying it in a congregate space that's a drop-in. And so I truly do believe that what we have in the resource materials on the site, including like housing-focused lower barrier shelter, like manual and guidelines, has application beyond the shelter. It has applications to say, like, how do we do this in a congregate space, like a drop-in space? As far as when you're looking for Indigenous shelters as your peers to draw from to that specific lens, I think this is where, in my limited experience in the time that I've been in this role, is still trying to build up that network. And what I have are non-Indigenous shelters that I've connected with who have partnered really well with Indigenous elders or knowledge keepers to inform more inclusive practices within their shelter that like honor that piece of their work. And so I'm wondering, one of them is in this room, that maybe Kevin can help us with that as far as like, you're not an Indigenous specific shelter, but you've made efforts to integrate into the shelter with that kind of consideration. Who did you lean on? Who are your friends, your partners from the Indigenous community that you really felt provided that guidance for you?
I think our first thing, oh, sorry. Sandra, jump in here too. But I think our first piece was that I'm not the person to lead that work, right? It needed to be led by individuals that were knowledge keepers, that were Indigenous individuals. So that's kind of where we started and where we looked at. We were fortunate in Calgary that we had a couple of organizations that we could work with on that. So I think it's about the partnerships. Like, you know, one of the things that we've identified is an increase of Indigenous population during winter months. So, you know, that's not the work, we're not the experts there. So we're looking at bringing in specific, like the Siksika Nation for outreach and that type of thing. So yeah, I think it's a ground up type work for that. And I would say that you are a shelter, and that housing focus model would fit into it identically the same way that it does in any shelter, because the housing work doesn't happen when people are sleeping, right? So it is the exact same.
Can I just add something to that, Grant?
Of course.
And I think a good point on like the Indigenous networks that we're trying to build, and that's certainly something we're trying to be really, really intentional of as we start moving forward in the network. So encourage you to join the network, and perhaps through you we can also start to build some of that connection as well.
I also realized that I didn't follow my own rules, which I was supposed to, for the sake of the recording, pose the question back into the microphone.
She had the mic.
Oh, right. My apologies. Right, we figured that out.
I just wanted to say as well, YWCA Hamilton has experience partnering with women's Indigenous organizations, and they have a recently new model about 3 years in. So if you read Medora Apples, the CEO of YWCA Hamilton, and does a lot of work, she may be able to lead you in the right direction. Okay.
Thank you, Joyce.
Saw a hand up. Is there a hand at that table? Yeah.
Is this on? Okay. My name's Krista. I'm from Bridgewater, Nova Scotia. I manage the homeless shelter there. It's very new. We're overnight only. We only have 15 beds. Nova Scotia doesn't have shelter standards at this current time. So I've been piecing province to province, like all of their shelter standards together to try to create policy and rules and all of that kind of stuff. And it's definitely difficult. Are there any shelter standards that you would recommend that we look at or go off of? Because we're like the only one.
Right. I know Chris wants to chomp on that one so bad.
Just so you know, I will be there soon. Actually, we'll be working with you in Bridgewater through org code. Yes, so I will have resource, will travel. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think your question, for me too, coming into this role, I was like, this is really confusing, because if I look at this from the end user's experience, like a shelter guest, if I'm in Edmonton, Alberta, and they just came out with their emergency shelter standards, or I'm in Barrie, Ontario, or in Nova Scotia, all those standards look different. And so as a shelter guest, I'm going to start to think, I don't know what's expected of me when I enter into this space. And that's not even just from city to city or province to province. That's also from shelter to shelter in the same city. So it creates a lot of guest confusion, and probably also a lot of confusion for managers or people who run shelters, people working in shelters. And so this is a way for us to also do a plug around a pilot project that we're currently doing in partnership with Org Code, the DI, and with the University of Calgary, where we have 5 pilot sites that are 5 shelters in Alberta, and we're trying to figure out what are those consistent guidelines that should be applied when we're talking about housing-focused lower barrier shelter. And so at the end of this pilot that should run about 18 months, there's going to be policy recommendations and some standardization around common understanding. What does it mean to be housing focused in lower barrier? What's the criteria in order to kind of meet that standard? Because there's a lot of confusion right now. And I think our hospitals don't function that way, right? If I go to a hospital in Windsor, Ontario, or in Halifax, as a patient going into the emergency department, I should relatively know what to expect. And I don't think we're there yet with our emergency shelter. So the intention with that pilot project is to say, how do we now scale this up beyond these 5 sites in Alberta and look at having an opportunity to really create some national guidelines?
I find it difficult too because we're so rural. And then we have shelters in Halifax that are like big city, and things are completely different from Halifax to Bridgewater. So we're struggling. We are one of the only low barrier shelters in all of Nova Scotia that allow folks to come in at like various states of intoxication just so they have a place safe to sleep. And it's definitely difficult when they're coming from shelters that have all these very, very strict rules, coming to a place that allows them to come in. Everybody's confused. I'm confused all the time. So yeah, it would definitely be nice to have some kind of standard somewhere.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too that I forgot to mention in the pilot project is when we started looking at site selection, we were very intentional around saying we need shelters from communities of various sizes. They can't all be Calgary's. So we needed smaller communities, larger communities, big shelters, small shelters, and shelters that also serve different populations with different mandates. Because we wanted to say whatever we develop hopefully has some recommendations or guidelines that have some universal application. Whether you are in a more remote rural community where maybe there isn't all the formal resources or options as they have in a larger community, in a larger shelter. We wanted to have greater application, kind of like getting ahead of the yeah but, right? Like a housing focused low barrier shelter would work in Calgary, but us in Grand Prairie were different. So yeah, but, right? So we're trying to kind of look at making sure that there's some different shelter types so that it can get to that issue. Exactly. Oh, at the back.
So we're from Winnipeg, we're at Slow Mission. I wanted to know if anyone has, when someone's not following policies, violence, whatever, we suspend them, and then we use the restorative circle practice to bring them back into our building, but I find it doesn't do anything. Do you guys have something that actually does work?
We're going to let Kevin take this one.
Kevin sent me something recently that's pretty awesome, so
Great to see you again. We do have a document that we can share through the network, absolutely no problem. So we spent quite a bit of time looking at our restrictive policies. And one of the pieces that we felt was missing from it recently was actually definitions around what each of the reasons were. It helped clarify for staff when they were actually looking at doing restrictive services, but it also supports with the guests when they can see a definition of what the reason is that they're being asked to leave. So yeah, we can certainly do that. And there are times that there are people that are not allowed in our shelter. We do not do that on a lifetime situation whatsoever. They're reviewed every 6 months or so, or people can advocate, but we can get you the definition document because it did really help, so.
Can you even talk about, like, there's a group in there, right, like a team in your shelter that's part of?
Yeah, so one of the things that we wanted to get away from was having individuals have to come in and say, hey, look, I did this or I did that and I'm sorry for it. There is a restorative justice piece for some individuals, but what we did was we formed a committee of internal staff that is housing staff, shelter staff, healthcare staff, security staff, and they actually review every single restriction of service. And that team has the ability at any point to remove a bar or possibly extend it. And part of their mandate and their terms of reference is the follow-up piece with the individuals. And it really helped with that, by having a group together, we start to remove some of the biases that may be in place. And we even have lanyard cards for individuals that we ask, if you're going to be placing a restriction of service, if I'm a staff member and I'm doing it, I have thing where it's like, have I checked my own biases? Where is my mental health continuum today? Have I spoken to someone about this? So kind of a set of questions that we ask before we have someone go to that restriction of service. And then our restrictions of services, 80% of them have gone from, you're gone for a day or 7 days to really just, can you go take a walk for 5 minutes? And that has been the big shift that has helped. So we can follow up as well for you if you like.
Can I just say as well, I think it's such a great question. And for all of us in this work, sometimes I think it's one of the unspoken questions. It's one of the scary questions to ask because we are the last line of defense. Like we are the social safety net of the social safety net. And so when we get to that point of having to say, you've got to leave, like the consequences are massive, morally and from a mission point of view, and it's almost existential. So I'm like it's one we need to bring into the light. We did some research recently at Old Brewery, and we bar more people than we thought we did, and not just men, women at our women's facilities as well. And we have to do better. We have to do better on that for the reasons I've mentioned. So just go back to what Sandra and Grant said. This is part of the purpose of this network, is to be in a space where we can talk about these sometimes really, really tough issues and be really honest about what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, and maybe some better methods that some members of the network can bring to bear on that.
And one just last thing on it that was really interesting, like we're in Calgary, so it's a little bit larger metropolitan area than some areas, but we worked really closely with one of our partnering agencies, another shelter that's low barrier. And we actually looked at who's like not allowed at the DI and who's not allowed at this other shelter. And the lists were actually completely opposite. So by forming those relationships with other shelters, we can say, hey, this individual is going to be removed from our facility, but we've called over to this other location and we can get you in over there. So by having that collaboration, which is this network plus within your own community, you can start to ensure that people aren't falling through those cracks as well.
Unless you're the only organization in your community, right? To your point. So anyway, so it's a great and complicated and profoundly important question.
Well, before we move on to the next question too, like I think that idea too of comparing lists almost is kind of, I would also say to my shelter peer to be like, what is different about your shelter that you're having a different outcome and greater success with Kevin when he comes to your shelter, because we're not seeing that same thing here. So tell us about some of the things that you're doing at your shelter that's creating good outcomes, or at least ensuring that Kevin isn't being asked to leave. We want to try and replicate that, and vice versa, right? And I think about that as like, we want to go through a restorative process, but not welcome someone back in with the same approach and the same model that potentially created that poor outcome last time. So how are we making adaptations to our engagement and our accommodation of that person the next time they come? I think about that when, like, my background is a lot in housing. It's like, we're going to rehouse someone as many times as it takes, but it'd be silly if we kept rehousing them the same way and expecting a different outcome. And I would think about that the same way that we accommodate our guests in the shelter. Brian, were you going to add something to that?
Yeah, Brian, Low Barrier Shelter in St. Thomas. So we're happy to share our shelter break process as well. Similar to what was said, we went through and realized, every time you restrict someone from services, you're not helping them. The partners around you can't find them. And so the spiral just gets deeper and deeper, and it's harder to bring them back out of it. So with us, it always starts with go for a walk. If you're really annoying, go for a walk until I'm done my shift, and then the next shift gets to see you in a different light. The other thing we did was, because there's nowhere else to go, we also use what we kind of think of as a dignity clause. So even though they may not be able to access, say, a room, like the beds upstairs, we wouldn't deny them access to a bathroom with secure, so they still have dignity to use a bathroom. And we won't refuse them access to see our medical doctor when he's in every Wednesday when they get their Sublocade shots or things like that. So it's a bit of give and take. They understand why they're getting a break. I mean, they all know why. And we post ours all around the center as well. The first 90 days is really interesting because as your team are enacting it and as your guests are getting used to it, but we went from writing so many incident reports, we've dropped our number of incident report writing by 30%. So we've added back capacity within our housing-focused case managers to do what they really want to do and what they were hired for. And it's interesting now out on the patio in the dining room when they go, hey, that's 3 days, or that's a day. They understand, and so they actually self-monitor themselves. And so just being transparent about it and understanding, we're going to let you go for a walk first, and we're going to walk away, because staying in their face when they're elevated, you just know it's going to get to that next level. So it is around changing your thought process, but you can't help them if they're not there. So anyway, so happy to share that.
Hi, Lori Bailey. I'm an inspector with Transit Public Safety and Emergency Management, Community Safety in Calgary, Alberta, in charge of the community outreach team. I just had a question about information sharing amongst shelters, and so I guess it was kind of directed, at the DI group in terms of Calgary area and individuals who are banned. What does that look like for a winter response with people? So like in terms of sharing information for the individuals who are banned and not allowed in the extreme weather, do you reach out to the other shelters when we're bringing them there? Or do we just take them to another shelter and ask there? Like, is there a plan in place for that? Like, I really find, and this might be a difficult question to answer, but I've only been in the role for 6 months, but I have over 30 years in public safety. But I really find that there's a lack of information sharing amongst shelters, because I kind of, from what I see so far, is that everybody wants to keep what they're doing to themselves. And that might only be from what I'm seeing, but people don't want to share what's going on at other sites, or we find that, well, we can't share that information with you because they're at this shelter, but we're trying to find a place for someone to go. I guess, does that make sense to you? Like what I'm saying, so if we have somebody and it's minus 35, they're banned, and there's only so many places they can go, what is the alternative to that? Like, I like this idea about the dignity, right, where you still let them in to use a bathroom, or things like that, instead of keeping them riding transit till 3 o'clock in the morning, like that.
Well, and sorry, Kevin, I'm going to just wait while the microphone comes back over to you. I think, Calgary is interesting because we are actually very collaborative as shelter providers, much more so than many other cities that I've experienced. But there are privacy restrictions in terms of what you can and cannot share. But I'm hoping that through a lot of the planning and collaboration through the extreme weather response this winter, that you'll see that we're a lot further along perhaps than your experience might show so far, at least, and we're always open to feedback. But Kevin can talk more to like the boots on the ground experience and what that looks like in real life, so to speak, when it's minus 30 and we've got someone coming from transit.
Yeah, I think what I'd love to do is sit down with you and just talk about our own internal policies and how we work with the city, because I think it is very unique to Calgary. But we do have what we call compassionate access, where if it's at a certain temperature, majority of individuals are allowed back in. There's certain times that it's not. But much the same as St. Thomas, individuals are allowed in for housing and healthcare and that type of thing. But our coordination within the city around cold weather response, specifically with the I think anyone that's in a larger city here is dealing with different issues on transit. We work with a program where we work with the city and bylaw and CPS and an outreach team, and we bus people from that team, part of that memorandum of understanding is your team calling ahead of time with the list of names to outline, and then we would say, this person is not allowed here, this person's not allowed here, this person. Like it's about that follow-up with the shelters before people come is part of that whole process that we worked out with the city and that organization. But we can sit down and talk more about what we can do to work together collaboratively.
I don't think I'm misunderstanding my question. It wasn't so much about what the BI is doing, it's just in general, like for winter response for you in this room. What do you do in the cold weather, right, when people are down? Is that the approach you have to, where you have a list where people can go, or like what strategically you can do to help people find warm shelter?
So one of the communities that I would have worked with recently, they sat down, again, multiple shelters in the same city, sat down, and before winter storm event would go through that banned, barred list and make sure, just like Kevin was saying, like that everybody on that list at least has access to one place. It doesn't mean opening the door back up for a place they just got restricted from, but to go through and identify who can be where, and for those folks that can't be anywhere, to make sure at the very least that street outreach teams know who that is and know who to be looking for. So I think really it's trust and communication amongst service providers, which is probably the answer to every question in this room. But if you're the only shelter in town, you do that internally. If there's multiple, you just like when you're the last stop. If you're the last stop, you have to make sure that people have somewhere to go.
In Montreal, I just maybe be interesting. We have at 25,000 feet, the big organizations who work perhaps like in Calgary pretty closely together. We've developed a common set of values that we've put together in a document called 3 Extra Steps. It's way better in French, 3 pas de plus. And it has principles around coordinated access and obviously housing orientation and so on. But one of them is that we don't work to the extent possible any way other than in a 24/7 way. You can't be housing focused if you're not 24/7. And we don't work seasonally either. So we cannot hire great staff and keep great staff, and so that they can do great work for the people that is on mission, which is focused on housing, if we're only working during the cold season. I just wanted to share that. That's the kind of a grounding principle for us. It's terrific for advocacy too. It's terrific for the stability of our organizations. It's terrific for the clientele as well, right? Totally. But and it makes sense as well in the high heat, in the big rain, in the low, like we are at a time when it's not just, I mean, it's super dangerous, right? And in your part of the world, our part of the world, north of 60 everywhere in this country in the deep winter, but it's dangerous all the time. So we need to, I think, put those principles together and think about it not just in terms of December 1st to March 31st.
Oh, good.
So we're from Oxford County, and we have a shelter system that is ran out of two churches. So one is a day space in a church, and then one is a night space in another local church. One of the things that we're experiencing is very high barrier. So a lot of people are not utilizing our shelter system. We're finding that to be a barrier in assisting people out of encampments and moving towards, housing first model. Do you have any suggestions on how to maintain and manage that type of a model, or are we just kind of left in the dark?
How to best manage a high barrier?
Well,
I would say don't.
Yeah.
But I think like what you're getting at too is like we've lost our way at some point here, right? And people who've seen me in webinars or wherever, my apologies, I've said it before, is like we have to use a customer service approach. When I go to the mall and I enter into, I don't know, I went to the Rideau Center and I was looking for fancy pants for a dinner tomorrow night, and I went into Frank and Oak and they didn't have the right fancy pants. And so I left. It would be wrong of Frank and Oak to say, well, Grant shops incorrectly. He doesn't know how to shop, right? As opposed to doing some market research and asking Grant to say, what was it about what was in our store? Was it the products, the salesperson's approach that led to you leaving without buying your pants? And I think about that the same way when it comes to emergency shelters. There are nights when shelters are over capacity, but there are nights when there's still space and there's still people outdoors. So surveying people directly who are in encampments, outdoors, not going into your shelter, saying like, why aren't you coming in? And they'll give you all the reasons. And there's some common themes of what comes up over and over and over again. And so shelter operators will say, well, it's really hard to like make the changes to our shelter in order to accommodate what will increase the likelihood of them coming indoors. And I stole this from Chris, but it's saying like, as hard as it is to change your shelter to meet human needs, it's harder to expect humans to change who they are in order to meet your shelter needs. And so I would use that approach when you're trying to influence your more high barrier shelters, is to say, who are we trying to serve? And how are we actually reaching them and bringing them in appropriately in a way that they want to receive support, as opposed to, and I was talking to someone this morning, I was like, if you told me that I had to give up staying somewhere with my wife or my dog or my child, I can find, albeit not very safe, I can make some type of makeshift encampment. I can't recreate my wife, my daughter, and my dog in the shelter. And so right away, I was like, right, of course I would say no to shelter. And I think what we're doing is we're unfairly putting people in a really difficult position around these opposing things that shouldn't be opposing around basic necessities of life or dignity and relationships and all that stuff that should be married together, right?
I would even, just to like, I like the fancy pants analogy. So to keep running with that, like, you wouldn't ask somebody to go to a place that had a limited amount of pants and go in the daytime, go to one location, and then at nighttime to go to a completely separate location, and maybe the pants are already gone. And then, so like, I think obviously you don't have a ton of power as the operator, but to be maintaining things out of two distinct spaces that are, for better or for worse, like, churches, like, will keep some people from accessing, and if that's the space, like, we've already eliminated a number of people who need shelter.
Yeah, and I also just want to point out too, like, it's trying to move towards high access or lower barrier, right? But it's not an on-off switch that's just going to happen overnight. But I've heard from shelters where there's like, okay, well, starting tomorrow, we're lower barrier, versus saying, like, how do we find things that we can start to change operationally over time, and then test it, and then as we feel like we have the capacity, is then to grow into, like, okay, maybe the next journey that we want to go on is how do we find ways to include pets? That's our next mission for the next year, right? But it's not an overhaul overnight. You'll completely overwhelm your staff, your system, your guests, everything, right?
Do we have time for one more?
I'm just, we have till 3, right? Like, I'm just pretending like this is like jazz. Like, there's a loose structure, and we just play notes within that loose structure.
Nice.
Okay.
Thanks. Just a question. I'm really interested to know how people respond to the issue of racist, oppressive language, bigoted language used by clients, guests in shelters. How do you respond? It impacts, obviously, in a very serious way, other residents, but also staff who it is often directed at. So, thanks.
Oh, we should have moved on before we got that hard question.
I believe...
Yeah, it is a phenomenal question.
And that's actually a question that comes up more and more, so I actually think...
Can I answer?
Of course, please do.
So I have a little bit of experience with this. I'm certified to facilitate anti-racism, anti-oppression, and over my years of overseeing programs, we have had this, where an individual actually refused service from a staff, or the staff has a right to not be aggressed towards or harassed in the workplace, such as that. So what I actually did was we implemented programs for the individuals, teaching them anti-racism, anti-oppression. So it takes a little bit of time. I would get the staff on board, knowing that we're addressing the issue. And honestly, within months, it's resolved, in my experience, each time. So I would find somebody who facilitates that and help them develop a program that you teach to the individuals that access your services.
But in the moment.
I would look back to your service restrictions policies.
Well, I think there's also folks who will be able to add to this, but I mean, there's always... low barrier doesn't mean high abuse for your staff, right? And so how are we ensuring safety and integrity for our staff? And that's good support and critical incident debriefing and all those things. And so there's the responding to the immediate issue that when it's happening in the moment, and treating it like a critical incident that requires a different approach than debriefing later around, now how do we restore some justice or some order from what just happened so that there isn't a recurrence of it.
I guess a name. So my name is Richard, program manager, Salvation Army out in Oakville. Myself, I've experienced it myself, being in my position as well as my staff. How we typically deal with it is having the conversation with the individual to, kind of have them understand how that is not accepted. And that can be received in many different ways. Most of the time, they are receptive when we have that conversation, and then you do have other individuals that it will continue. If it does, that's when we go through that progressive discipline. So that could be a warning, written, verbal, and then just progresses into the point where we do make them understand that it potentially could jeopardize their stay if it continues. Because it does impact the staff, your team, debriefing. Because for some people, you don't know their experiences, what they've went through, that could be a trigger for them. So just having a conversation with your staff as well as the individual to help them understand how that is not acceptable, because it isn't. And also giving them an opportunity to correct it and work with them, because we also want to, provide them a space if we are, and not just right out the gate, like, you're out of here. It's like, no, let's have a conversation, but if it does continue, this is kind of what the end result will be. So that's kind of how we deal with it over there.
Thank you, Richard from Oakville.
Tessa, did you want to add something to that? Tessa, where are you from?
Hi, I'm Tessa. I'm the CEO of Salem Mission, which is in Winnipeg. We're Winnipeg's largest shelter. Yeah. And probably some teammates in the room could speak better to this because they're living it. But we did bystander impact training for our staff. And so we really made it clear that white staff, or white presenting staff anyway, but needed to step in when people were experiencing anti-Black racism, if that's what that person had already said they wanted. So we needed, on your team, you need to have the conversation. You need to know, actually, I want to handle that myself, or I really don't want to handle that myself. And you know, experiencing anti-Black racism, our Black staff are very clear, like, I'd rather be punched, like, I'd rather be physically assaulted. And so we were like, okay, well, then we need to take it as serious as we would take a physical assault. And if somebody smaller is, you know, or whatever is, you know, then we have staff jump in. So Jeff and Christine are in the room. So they'll, on radio, like, or if they see it, or they'll know, like, some community members are pretty consistent in their racism. So we'll know, oh, okay, that person's starting to go after so-and-so. Let's make sure that a white staff is interrupting, or an Indigenous staff is interrupting. But we also established a Black employee network. And so our frontline staff, who are amazing, many have lived experience, many have lots of great training and skills, can go talk to other Black staff that are not frontline and say, help carry this with me. And so we have a human resources training and development lead who coordinates that. And he's a facilitator in the Black community in Winnipeg. So he coordinates a group, and they not only do, like, hey, stuff sucks, they also do, like, Black Cultural Month and have Black celebration days where they wear, you know, traditional garb and play music from their different nations. And so really it was about recognizing Blackness as a distinct group within our team that needed specific caretaking for retention, but also required that our team know how to step in and where to step in appropriately, and where not to step in. So allyship is not, I'm walking alongside you because this is your problem. Racism is a white people's problem, typically. And so how do we step in as owners of white supremacy in our nation and challenge that and walk alongside Black staff and how they want to be walked alongside. So this has also led to Black mental health training for our whole team. So what is mental health in the context of Blackness? We've had a training on African diaspora. And so just like, how do we have the whole team know more so that they have better tools so that when they are having that conversation with somebody in community, kind of one-on-one, they also have more information to have that in a good way. For us, the hardest thing is we have a couple people who actually typically don't present with racism, but do when they're in meth psychosis. So then we can know that in advance. And okay, so-and-so's coming in, how are they doing today? They appear to be in psychosis today. We need to make sure that we're not having a lot of Black staff interact with them. And we've lost staff over it because this particular individual is really challenging. So also, how do we continue to serve him, but keep our staff safe? But I would say the Black Employee Network is the crucial part of this. Like we said, let's create a network. I sat down with all Black staff across the organization. We're 185 people were invited to come, whoever wanted to, tell me what that looks like. From there, we created the BEN, is what it's called. And now the BEN meets regularly, and we send them questions about, like, hey, we noticed Black staff aren't participating in this, why not? Or whatever. And then they actually give me operational direction on how to better support Black staff.
Cool. Thanks, Tessa.
There was one more hand up.
Thank you. My name is Asha. I'm from Vancouver Aboriginal Friendship Center Society. I have a couple of things. First, I would like to add on what's already discussed regarding race and this kind of response by shelter support workers. From our perspective at the Vancouver Aboriginal Friendship Center, we operate two shelters. One has a capacity of 100 beds per night, and it's always full. The other one has 55 beds, and it's our flagship shelter. And encountering these situations, what we did at management level was to provide empathy fatigue, compassion fatigue training for staff, and that actually changed the perspective from which our staff look at things and how they respond. So that might be beneficial for some of the shelter operators here. My question that I would like to ask the network is actually for the operators, shelter operators in Vancouver, we usually go to the Homelessness Services Association of BC. That is in my understanding, very similar to the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network, from what I hear from you regarding the activities that you do. And my question is therefore, how different is the Canadian Shelter Transformation Network for us to look at you and maybe seek support if you have any idea of how that operates? The other one, we tried to actually connect with you a year ago because we were introduced to the Transformation Network in a conference at Winnipeg. And we tried to reach out to you, but I don't know if that was a system failure from your website side, but we haven't heard anything back. Now is a good opportunity, I know, but I just want to...
It's Tim Richter's fault.
Blame Tim Richter. Put that on your feedback card.
Grant's here now.
Yeah, so I'll say it was the last guy's fault before I came, but there was no guy before me, right? So you probably reached out to some link on the website that unfortunately there was a gap where it wasn't being monitored. And so my apologies. And so I would love to follow up with you to kind of know what you were reaching out for at that time. And we can pick up the ball and start running with it again. I really encourage anybody to be like, just email me directly. And I love my email address. It's just grant@transformshelter.ca. It's in the brochure, but to your first question, the name of the association actually is it BC? Yeah. I'd have to go and kind of look and get more familiar with the specifics of what they say they deliver. I mean, for us, it's really about specific to, we're trying to create a movement of a radical transformation of emergency shelters to be housing focused and lower barrier. As really the big driving force, or as kind of Sandra mentioned, like the engine to really contribute to ending homelessness. So there's a lot of work that goes into operationalizing that when you're making that change internally in your shelter. And so that's where we feel we focus a lot of our tools, the resources that we make available on the site, the coaching that we can provide, the way that we focus the topics for the network. So I would say that's our primary focus that might differentiate us a bit from that other group. Other questions? Oh.
I'm going to go to the one person that didn't have the mic yet first.
Hi, my name's Nikki. I'm from Timmins, Ontario, a small northern community. We are a low barrier housing focused homeless shelter. We're in it deep. One of the big things that we struggle with in our community right now, our community is very torn. So we have a lot of support from community, but we have a lot of hate from community in regards to homeless people and our shelter being the only shelter in the community. So my question is, as we run with this low barrier housing focused shelter, we have run into not being able to have community partners come into our shelter to help us. So one of the big things, that we're learning from all these sessions is the community approach. We're really lacking that. So I guess my question is, has anyone experienced this, and how have you been able to change the narrative to get partners into the shelter? We don't, again, our town is, we have, one of everything, and none of them will access our shelter because it is low barrier. So how do we change that narrative, if there is a way?
Right. So I just want to make sure the narrative is that your shelter is too high risk from a health and safety perspective to send in.
For everyone, for our mental health agencies,
Okay.
for our healthcare workers, for essentially any service that our clients would need.
Yeah.
We're too, we've tried to put things in, we've tried to put monitors in to help with security, different things like that, but we still run into people not wanting to enter the door to service clients.
Before I pass it over to other folks, I have just a couple of things to make note of. One, it's your community sounds like they've turned low barrier shelters into the boogeyman.
Yes.
You know, when we think about, we do that with fentanyl, we do it with shelters in general, depending on the community. We can think of all of the things that we've turned over the years into the boogeyman that seems like terrifying and you can't possibly work safely with whatever the setting or the situation might be. So I think there's some demythologizing that needs to happen. If that is about relationships with the leaders of those community organizations. The other thing is I'm going to do a bit of a plug for our December webinar, December 18th. It was actually being shelter leaders from a few different communities that have introduced lower barrier shelter services who are going to talk about perceptions of safety and deconstructing people's ideas of thinking that more rules means greater safety. And the work that they did with a lot around with their staff around trying to move away from a rule-based approach and actually showing how more rules means more likelihood of conflict, which increases the likelihood of higher risk situations. But then not just introducing that with their staff, but introducing that in their community conversations with other service providers and trying to replicate similar training that they did internally in their shelters with in-service education with their community partners as a way to try and bridge that gap and get them in to come in and provide that service. I'm not sure if there's other folks who have other thoughts around how they did some of that bridging.
I'm just, I feel terrible. Like what? I mean, you know, some community organizations, you know, kind of maybe can understand that, you know, their teams maybe don't have the mandate training, whatever, to come in. But if I'm hearing correctly, you're also saying institutional partners are not coming in. Okay, so.
So, yeah, our community has recently been very split, where we almost have like vigilantes in the community. Yeah.
There's a whole website on Facebook. It's called The Voices of Timmins, and it's basically just a website that bashes the shelter.
And it's
trying to help people who are experiencing.
Yeah, like it's over like a 10,000 kind of follower thing. Like, and it's, you know, we've tried to bring partners into our shelter, and it's resulted in, you know, that agency having half their team quit. Like it's very intense.
Wow.
I think that's why these sessions should happen probably more often, so that we can just give everybody a friggin' hug on the way out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
this won't be like an immediate fix, but like obviously there's a lot of shelters in a lot of places that are blamed for homelessness as opposed to being supported as a solution toward, or a process towards a solution. So clearly you're the problem. Like there's this weird magic bus somewhere in Ontario that drives people around at night and drops them off to the little town. Yeah, so you also drive the bus. One of the approaches, again, it's not an immediate fix, and it's particularly challenged when there's a large group of community members who are just going to be against everything you do. But I'm embarrassed that I'm going to say this out loud. Community liaison committees can be strategic if you can put that together and really like put together a group of, you know, key stakeholders, key neighbors next to where your shelter is, and facilitate and manage that group well so that they can, so like run with that as much as possible, because at the very least they can funnel information back out to folks who don't listen to information well.
Yeah. I also think, like, in a previous life, I did some work in another community in Stratford, or in Ontario, called Stratford. And they had a different name for their Facebook. It was called like Stratford Connect or something. And it was a lot of like quasi-intel about essentially targeting and vilifying shelter guests, people experiencing homelessness, and anybody connected to them that's trying to respond to homelessness. Whether you call it a community liaison committee or you rebrand it and name it something else, there could be members of your community outside of the shelter who have very legitimate concerns, and you probably want to know about them. It's just that the outlets or the way that they're going about sharing them seem really toxic. And so how do you create some kind of portal or framework to take those concerns and make it constructive? And then hopefully you're turning them into allies, because I also say I could talk about solutions to homelessness till I'm blue in the face, but if I represent a certain sector, I've lost credibility before I even open my mouth with certain people from certain walks of life, right? You're just another social worker who's going to defend folks that I don't like at my expense. So I think it's good to have those allies beyond your shelter if you can create them through some kind of like liaison group.
Yeah, adding on to that, so we've created like a neighborhood group and we invited our neighbors for dinner and we had them do a bit of a tour, and that's been really helpful. We don't call ourselves low barrier, even though we're low barrier, we call ourselves behavioral based. And yeah, so the behaviors need to be high access. I like that even better. Your behavior needs to be safe, it needs to be respectful, and it needs to be focused on meeting the needs of everyone who's in the room. And so that, because we knew that low barrier for us was going to be villainized. And so like ultimately we're low barrier, but we call it behavior based. And then people could be like, oh, it's actually just based on whether you can be respectful. And we often use the example, and you'll know who I'm talking about because you introduced me to her. We had a younger woman who used to come through our space often, who was always high on meth and smiled at people and cleaned like all the time. And we had a grumpy old sober guy who picked fights. And so we'd say like, how do we restrict him? How do we not restrict him from access when she's vulnerable in totally different ways and isn't? So we just tried to like root it in story because we switched from being sober required to being behavior based. And so for us, it was like, here's the stories of who this impacts and what it looks like. And then also having folks with lived experience on your team who are willing to talk about being lived experience and their journey, and having people with lived experience on your team all the time. And then if some of them are also like, hey, I'd love to share my story, great. And so how do your leadership kind of work with those people to share their stories in important ways? But like another big thing for us and different in Winnipeg, I don't know if people know the Jets, but the guy who owns the Winnipeg Jets is an ally of our shelter now, right? We had him for a tour and he's a supporter. So like he's in one of our recent videos, and until yesterday everybody loved them because they're on a winning streak. So like also get like, who could you get in Timmins? And I don't know Timmins, sorry, but who could you get to be your backer and your supporter? You just kind of need one person to start a tipping point, and happy to talk through how we did that with some folks, if that'd be useful to you.
Yeah, that's, I think, if I may, just.
You always call the media to our events.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I invite the media to everything.
I just quickly want to follow up and say, go Leafs.
All right. I think the great point, just to make sure we underline it, is that this is not just on like you. I don't, I'm sure you're not sensing this is, like this huge heavy backpack is all yours to bear. Your board, your civic leaders, foundation leaders, donors, like they are your potential allies. And where I'm from, low barrier is actually, your organization's going to take the the tough, complex people. Good on you. Thank you for doing that. So there's this whole like narrative. Low barrier is a good thing. It is a good thing for community because you're bearing the weight that others aren't. So, and I just wanted to make sure you knew that.
And Grant, media relations should be a topic for shelters in the future. We should do that. But to your point, so staff, thank you. We actually send the media like, here's what we're saying, here's all of the talking points, here's quotes. And like when we announced our move to behavior-based, we made national news, which was wild. But it literally, like they changed 6 words in what I sent them and otherwise published my article word for word. So if you do their work for them, they're not going to do the work of framing the story, and then you get your framing out there.
Thanks. I just want to piggyback on this too. It doesn't matter. Had the opportunity to work with shelters across Canada. Small shelters, big shelters, doesn't matter what city you're in, we all deal with this, right? But one of the things that we found that has really helped is actually starting in community talking about the work we do. Not just that we're a shelter, but like we are an engine to ending homelessness, that we are supporting 2,000 people a month with wound care. And I've sat in community rooms where it started out very hostile, and we started talking about all the amazing work we do and how community is part of that. By the end of it, we start to see some of that change, right? So I think sharing all the work that we do will really help to start to move some of that instead of just being labeled as a low barrier shelter. We're housing focused shelters that do a lot more than that. I think what's our tagline? Our tagline is more than emergency shelter, and that's where we try to anchor it in.
Hello, everybody. My name is Joyce Elson. I'm the Executive Director at Zach's Group Crisis Center. We're a new startup safe beds facility in Northern Ontario, neighbor to Nikki and Timmins. I asked my team what they would like me to ask, and they want to ask about food. So we prepare meals, quite lovely meals. We try to adhere to public health guides. We serve meals. There's a lot of incidents that occur over the food. I want to know what other shelters do. Do you serve food, and how do you manage that? Thank you.
We serve food, but I had a conversation with Tessa today about how they do breakfast, and I think she needs to answer this.
Are you okay to talk, Tessa?
Yeah. So our breakfasts are unlimited. And so we recognize that that's everybody's grouchiest time of day. So if you can get as many breakfast plates as you want to, but we serve for like there's an hour window that we serve. If you need to wake up early in shelter, we do really significant bagged lunches. And we always have sandwiches at the door. So if somebody's restricted to that dignity point, you can still get food, you can still get emergency clothes. You can still see your caseworker, depending on what you did. You could probably still go to the health clinic. So the breakfasts come up as many times as you want. And then for lunch, once we get through the line, people can then go up for seconds. And same thing with dinner. And so again, but those are like time-stamped windows. And then if you miss, then there's the to-go whatever. Like sometimes it's chickpeas and rice, sometimes it's a sandwich, whatever it might be. And so that's kind of how our kitchen relies on 32 volunteers a day to operate our food service, because we're not funded for that at all. I don't know did I say what you wanted me to say? Yeah.
That's good, thank you. And
Yeah.
coffee, unlimited?
No, yes, until 10. Yeah, so we only serve coffee 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. And then it's water or juice, depending on what we have in stock. And then we do a pop-up overnight winter response, and that only serves hot chocolate. So just, and we're really clear, like all of the food we're getting, like we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on food, to be honest, but most of the food we're serving is all donated. So we're just like, we order coffee and we order juice, but otherwise it's all donated. So we're just clear with folks, like this is what we have right now. We always have kosher options and we always have vegetarian options, but otherwise it's just, this is kind of how the food process works. And key, I think, we have tables where we serve you. So if you have a physical disability or something else going on for you, our staff are lovely and will know that and will ask you to sit in a certain area. And we serve all of those people sitting down. And then otherwise you are asked to line up.
And we avoid lines because we know lines can be a source of conflict. So we generally have volunteers that come in, sometimes sponsor a meal, and then we'll bring the meals to people as they're seated. And then generally there's 2 or sometimes 3 waves of people. On average, it's about sometimes up to 1,000 meals per serving.
Richard here again. Similar to the young lady that was just speaking, we do 3 meals. Our breakfast is continental. We open it up at 5 a.m., so they have access from 5 a.m. to 9 a.m., so quite a bit of time. We have early risers, so it kind of accommodates everyone. Then we do our lunch. We do have a cook, so we do have a cook. We buy our food. We do get donations as well. They get about an hour to eat. Same thing for dinner. And then at snack time, we do a snack around 9-ish. Try not to give them a lot of sugar because then they won't go to sleep. But coffee is pretty much throughout the day. They have access to that. We find that's a hot commodity. So that's kind of how we do our meals at our location.
Can I ask a question? Did they say because we were starting 15 minutes late, we get to go 15 minutes longer, or do we still have to do our end time at 3 o'clock?
That wasn't covered.
James.
What do we think?
I think that one is I'm super impressed by this group because Sandra and I were like, well, what if no one shows up to this session and no one has questions? We're like, well, we'll just catch up and we'll figure out what we want to do. So these, like, your participation, your attendance has been incredible, and I think that this is just like a start of a bunch of other conversations. So I really do encourage you, if you're not already a member, to scan the QR code or just email me, because I want to hear like what topics are important to you. Want to hear if you need help with anything or need help bridging a connection to someone who somewhere else in Canada is already kind of working on that. So I would also say, like, our one big question to the audience, and you can come and approach any of us during the time that we're here, is to say, like, if CSTN is going to be value added for you, what do you need to see from us over the next like couple of years? And you can be as specific as you want to be. And we'll take that down, and it will help kind of inform what we really focus on over the next little while. I'm trying to be a good moderator and facilitator. Yeah, like we're not going anywhere. We'll be here for the next couple of days. James, do you want to provide some closing remarks?
Yeah, I'll just maybe just say just a couple of things. First of all, I guess when you think about setting these things up, you do indeed lower expectations, but this is greatly exceeded my expectations. I've learned so much. Maybe you have too. Maybe you get a sense that we're just warming up here. I've been around the sector for a very long time. This is my second tour at Old Bury. I was there 2004 to 2008, and we tried to create something called the Canadian Shelter Network. The word transformation was added 5 or 6 years ago, and it's been off and on. COVID, a little thing called COVID, really hurt. But the fact that we now have a coordinator, the fact that we are embedded within the CAH family, means I think we have some sustainability now, sustaining these kinds of conversations in all their slices. The very first question off the top was just brilliant about the plight of Indigenous homelessness in general, Indigenous women murdered and missing. Like, that is a whole cut of the work that we have to do together, and from a network point of view, to be supportive of organizations such as yours, and with even the other questions that come out of it. Medical inreach, you're doing wound care as well. There's so much wound care that is being done around here, but we have so many things in common, whatever our size, whatever population we serve, that I profoundly believe this network can be valuable to us. And let's co-construct it together over the years ahead through the webinars, through the meetings, and so on. And one thing as well, and Grant mentioned it, this initiative around guidelines for shelters. What is it to be housing focused? What is it to be low barrier? It's an ongoing conversation. But if we do share the mission of the CAH of doing our share, or maximize the movement towards ending homelessness, like for real, I think those are two of the vectors that we have to actually put in place, being housing focused, being low barrier, to actually achieve it. But do we want to proceed forward and take what's happening in Alberta, this really exciting evidence-based initiative that's going on there around guidelines, how to go from what would be a standard to where people are now, and help that process through ORG code in particular to get up to a standard to say, I am an accredited housing focused low barrier shelter. Would that be helpful in Timmins? Would that be helpful in Timmins when you're starting to take on, the big fight with the community as to whether you're a legitimate enterprise or not? I think it may. I know it would in Montreal, by the way. It'd be very, very helpful as we face this brutal problem of cohabitation and NIMBY, stopping us in our tracks, trying to expand the kind of services we know we need to offer. So anyway, I just want to just say thank you on behalf of the network, the CAEH, and let's dig in and let's get better together.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I know that was closing remarks, but I'm going to also just plug again, in the front of the room, besides the membership registration QR code, there's other QR codes about an anonymous surveys that you can complete with the University of Calgary. It helps us to understand what housing-focused resources or practices that you're already doing, and where you're hoping to grow next and what you need help with. That will give us insights around like what mechanisms need to be in place in order for shelter operators to feel like they can go down this journey with us. So please scan away, but also come by the booth with any questions or anything over today, tomorrow, and Thursday. Thank you so much.